My phone buzzed across the kitchen counter just as I finished rinsing my coffee mug. I almost ignored it. It was late afternoon. The kind of quiet hour when the house felt too still and my thoughts felt louder than usual. But the screen lit up again, this time with a message from an old college friend I hadn't spoken to in years. No greeting. No explanation. Just a link. I tapped it without thinking. Instagram opened instantly. And there he was. My husband, Daniel Whitmore, standing in our living room with a glass of whiskey in his hand, smiling like he had just won something. The caption sat under his picture like a punch to the throat. 32-year-old wife finally gone. No more feeding dead weight. My fingers went cold before my mind could even process the words. Beneath it, the numbers kept climbing, over 1,000 likes already. And still rising. I stared at the screen, trying to understand what I was seeing. At first, I thought it had to be some kind of misunderstanding, maybe a joke that got out of hand. But then I scrolled down, and the comments began to appear, one after another, like a crowd gathering to watch someone fall. Someone joked about how I had never held a real job long enough to matter. Another wrote laughing emojis and said Daniel must feel finally free. I recognized names, neighbors, acquaintances, people who had sat at our dinner table and smiled politely while I served them dessert. My chest tightened with every swipe of my thumb. Then I saw Claire's comment, Daniel's older sister. She had tagged several of her friends and written, "Warning. This is the kind of woman you never marry." I felt my breath catch in my throat. Claire had always been polite to my face, always asking about my day in that syrupy tone that never quite felt genuine. Now her words sat there in plain view, sharp and public. I kept scrolling even though every part of me wanted to stop. That was when I saw a name that hurt more than all the others combined. My ex-boyfriend. No comment. No explanation. Just a single like under Daniel's post. As if he had been waiting years for this moment to happen. I pressed my lips together, forcing myself not to cry. For years, Daniel had told me money was tight. He said we needed to be careful, that every dollar mattered. I believed him. I turned down job interviews because commuting would cost too much. I stopped buying clothes that made me feel confident. I worked small freelance projects from home, convincing myself that sacrifice meant loyalty. Looking back, it all felt like pieces of a story I hadn't realized I was trapped inside. Daniel handled everything financial. Bank accounts, tax documents, insurance. He always said it was easier if one person took care of it. I trusted him because that's what wives were supposed to do. I never logged into our accounts, never questioned the numbers. I thought responsibility looked like control back then. Now it looked like secrecy. As I continued scrolling, one comment made me stop. It didn't sound like the others. It read, "She never even knew what was really hers." I stared at the words longer than I should have. They didn't sound like a joke. They sounded like knowledge, like someone knew something I didn't. My hands stopped shaking. Something inside me shifted. Quiet but unmistakable. Instead of reading emotionally, I started thinking logically. I tapped the screenshot button and captured the post. Then the comments. Then the likes, one by one, carefully, methodically, as if I were collecting evidence instead of humiliation. Then I did something that would have confused anyone watching me. I pressed the like button under the first insulting comment. Then the second. Then the third. I kept going until my own approval mark sat beneath every cruel sentence written about me. If they believed I was weak, they would relax. If they relaxed, they would keep talking. And if they kept talking, they might reveal more than they meant to. I set the phone down and sat at the kitchen table, staring at the dark screen of my laptop. My reflection stared back at me, tired, pale, but no longer trembling. Pieces of the past began lining up in my mind. Daniel controlling finances. Strange paperwork I barely remembered signing. That odd comment about what was really mine. None of it felt accidental anymore. I opened my email and searched for old financial records. Nothing appeared. No account summaries. No mortgage details. No investment reports. The absence felt louder than any insult I had just read. For the first time, fear replaced humiliation. A memory surfaced. Sharp and sudden. My mother's voice. Years ago. Mentioning a lawyer she trusted more than anyone else. "If something ever feels wrong," she had said, "call Margaret Sloan." At the time, it sounded like one of those cautious warnings parents give without reason. Now it felt like instructions I had ignored for too long. I closed Instagram and placed my phone face down on the table. The kitchen felt silent again. But it was a different kind of silence now, heavier, more deliberate. I opened the laptop and typed a name into the search bar. Margaret Sloan. My finger hovered over the call button for a moment. I wasn't calling to cry. I wasn't calling to defend myself. I was calling to find out what had been hidden from me all along. The next morning, I sat in my car outside Margaret Sloan's office, gripping the steering wheel tighter than necessary. The building was smaller than I expected. Brick walls. Narrow windows. Nothing flashy. It didn't look like the kind of place where lives were turned upside down. But the folder resting on my lap told me otherwise. Inside were screenshots from the night before. Every cruel comment frozen in time. When I stepped inside, the air smelled faintly of paper and coffee. Margaret greeted me with a firm handshake and eyes that missed nothing. She didn't waste time with sympathy. She took the folder, sat behind her desk, and began flipping through the pages one by one. Her expression stayed neutral, but the silence felt heavier than any reaction. After a few minutes, she looked up and asked, "Has your husband always controlled the finances?" The question hit me harder than the insults online. I nodded slowly. He said it was easier that way. Margaret didn't respond right away. Instead, she turned her computer screen toward me and began typing my full name into a public records database. I watched the cursor blink, expecting nothing to appear. But then a result popped onto the screen, a property listing tied directly to my name. A warehouse, purchased 3 years ago. My stomach dropped so fast it felt like falling. "That's not possible," I whispered. "I never bought anything like that." Margaret clicked deeper into the record. Mortgage documents appeared, followed by scanned signatures. My name was written across the page in looping letters that looked disturbingly close to my own handwriting, but not quite identical. Close enough to fool someone who didn't know me. "How long has this been happening?" I asked, my voice barely audible. Margaret didn't answer immediately. She scrolled further until another name appeared beneath the witness section. Claire Whitmore, Daniel's sister. The room felt smaller, like the walls had shifted closer together. Claire's face flashed in my mind, her polite smile, her gentle tone, the way she always offered help just when Daniel needed something signed. Suddenly, memories I once trusted began to feel staged. Margaret opened another set of documents, linking the warehouse to a registered business account. The company name meant nothing to me, but the ownership record did. My name was listed again, printed in bold letters that made my chest tighten. "I don't understand," I said. "I've never owned a business." Margaret pulled up transaction records next. Lines of numbers filled the screen, transfers moving back and forth across accounts I had never seen before. Thousands of dollars shifting hands without my knowledge. Years of activity hidden behind a name that legally belonged to me. Then she leaned back in her chair, her voice calm but heavier than before. "If anything illegal happened under your name, you are the one legally responsible." Fear replaced the numb shock that had carried me through the morning. My mind filled with images I didn't want to see. Courtrooms, debt collectors, strangers examining my life as if it were evidence. My phone vibrated against the desk. A new message. Claire's name flashed across the screen. I hesitated before opening it. My fingers suddenly cold again. The message was short, just a single line. "You should stop digging." I stared at the words, feeling the air leave my lungs. She knew. Somehow, she already knew what I was doing. Margaret read the message over my shoulder, her expression tightening for the first time since I arrived. She didn't say anything for a few seconds, just watched the screen like she was calculating something invisible. Finally, She spoke in a low voice. That confirms coordination. She turned back to her computer, aligning documents side by side. Dates, transactions, signatures. Everything began forming a timeline that stretched back years. The more we uncovered, the clearer it became that this wasn't random carelessness or misunderstanding. It was design. I thought about all the times Daniel discouraged me from taking jobs, telling me it was safer to stay home, safer to rely on him. At the time, his words sounded protective. Now they sounded strategic. Margaret closed the last file and leaned forward, resting her hands on the desk. "This doesn't look accidental," she said quietly. I swallowed, bracing myself. "It looks intentional." She paused long enough for the words to sink in. Then she added, "If we're right, this doesn't end with divorce." Silence filled the room. "It ends in court." Day one began with the sound of folders sliding across Margaret's desk. She arranged them in neat rows: property, banking, business, each label staring back at me like a warning sign. The air inside her office felt colder than before, heavier with purpose. This was no longer confusion or fear. This was preparation. Margaret explained that every detail had to be placed in order. Every document aligned with a date. Every transaction tied to a moment in my life. We built a timeline together, starting from the day I married Daniel. That was where the pattern began. Small changes at first. Access disappearing. Accounts shifting. Documents signed during moments I barely remembered. It was like watching my own life unfold from a distance. Except this version didn't belong to me. My phone rang suddenly, cutting through the silence. An unfamiliar number flashed on the screen. I hesitated before answering, my pulse quickening. A calm voice introduced herself as a representative from a regional bank. She asked if I was aware of a business loan registered under my name. My throat tightened as I answered, "No." She listed the amount, and my fingers curled into my palm. It was more money than I had ever earned in a single year. The loan was tied to the company Margaret had uncovered, and according to the records, several payments had already been missed. Fear settled deep in my chest, heavier than the humiliation I had felt the night before. This wasn't about embarrassment anymore. This was about survival. Before I could steady myself, another message appeared on my phone. Claire again. I opened it slowly, my stomach twisting before I even read the words. This time, she had attached an image, a scanned document with my signature printed at the bottom. "You signed more than you remember." The message read. My breath caught. I handed the phone to Margaret, who studied the image with narrowed eyes. She pointed to the edges of the signature, explaining how certain strokes didn't match the rhythm of my handwriting. Altered. Not forged completely, but adjusted just enough to pass unnoticed. "They're watching you," she said quietly. The words settled into the room like dust. Margaret continued searching through archived records, her movements precise and controlled. Then she stopped, her fingers hovering above the keyboard. She opened a document older than my marriage, something buried deep in the system. The title read, Family Trust Agreement. I leaned forward, confused. Margaret began reading aloud, her voice steady as she traced the lines of legal language. My name appeared in bold print, primary beneficiary. The trust included real estate, investment funds, and business shares that had been established years before I met Daniel. My father's name appeared at the bottom of the document, followed by the date it had been finalized. I stared at the screen, trying to process what I was seeing. Daniel had known. He had to. Margaret explained that controlling my finances would have given him indirect control over everything tied to the trust. The story about money being tight suddenly felt like a lie rehearsed over years. This had never been about protecting our household. It had been about controlling access to something I didn't even know existed. I leaned back in the chair, letting the silence stretch around me. The fear inside me began to shift, slowly changing shape. It didn't disappear, but it hardened into something steadier, something sharper. "What happens if we prove all of this?" I asked. Margaret met my gaze without hesitation. Then everything changes. Day 9 arrived faster than I expected. By then, stacks of evidence covered the desk, printed copies, digital backups, notes marking every suspicious transaction. Nothing felt uncertain anymore. Every piece fit into place like a puzzle I never wanted to solve. Margaret closed the final folder and placed it in front of me. "Tomorrow," she said quietly. "We stop surviving." She paused just long enough for my heartbeat to echo in my ears. "Tomorrow, we go public." That night, I returned home to an apartment that felt smaller than before. The silence pressed against the walls, thick and uneasy. I set my phone on the kitchen counter and stared at it, waiting for something I couldn't name. Then it buzzed. An unknown number flashed on the screen. I didn't answer. I just watched it ring, knowing that whatever came next would change everything, and not just for me. Day 10 arrived with a silence that felt heavier than any argument I had ever had with Daniel. Margaret placed the final folder in front of me, its edges perfectly aligned. Its label reading, "Official Filing." The words made my chest tighten. Not with fear this time, but with certainty. There would be no stepping back after this. She slid a pen toward me. For a moment, my hand hovered above the paper. I thought about the kitchen counter, the Instagram post, the laughter frozen in screenshots. I thought about every time I doubted myself, every time I believed I was the problem. Then I lowered the pen and signed my name in one steady motion. The ink dried quickly, sealing a decision that had been building for years. Margaret wasted no time. She sent copies of the documents to financial institutions, regulatory offices, and Daniel's business partners. Each message carried proof, transactions, signatures, timelines, everything that turned suspicion into evidence. I watched the screen as emails disappeared one by one, each one setting something irreversible into motion. Minutes later, her inbox refreshed. A new message appeared at the top of the screen. She opened it without hesitation. One of Daniel's partners had responded already. The subject line read, "Urgent contract suspension." I felt something shift inside me, like the first crack forming in a wall that had stood too long. My phone buzzed on the desk. Daniel's name flashed across the screen. I let it ring. Then it rang again, and again. Missed calls stacked on top of each other until the list blurred into a single line of desperation. Messages followed seconds later, short at first, then longer, frantic, filled with words that didn't sound like the man who had once mocked me in public. Claire texted next. Her message was brief. I didn't know it would go this far. I read it twice, feeling the strange calm that comes when fear finally burns itself out. More messages arrived from people who had laughed at me online. The same names that once felt like knives. Now their words sounded different, hesitant, uncertain. Apologetic? I opened Instagram again and found Daniel's post. The same photo remained, but the noise around it had vanished. Comments were disabled. The laughing voices were gone, replaced by silence that felt louder than humiliation ever had. A voice message arrived from Daniel. I stared at it for several seconds before pressing play. His voice trembled as he spoke, stripped of the confidence he once carried so easily. "I didn't think you'd actually fight back," he said. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the words settle. He had never feared losing me. He had feared losing control. Margaret's phone chimed again, and she turned the screen toward me. Official notice. Investigation opened. Accounts frozen. Business operations suspended. The collapse had begun, and it wasn't loud or dramatic, it was methodical, quiet, unstoppable. Later that evening, I stepped into my new apartment for the first time. Boxes lined the walls, stacked unevenly like proof of a life beginning again. The space smelled faintly of fresh paint and possibility. I placed my bag on the floor and sat beside it, letting the silence settle around me. After a few minutes, I opened an old folder I hadn't touched in years. My design portfolio lay inside, pages slightly worn but still intact. Each project reminded me of the person I used to be, the one who believed in her own ability, the one who didn't need permission to exist. An email notification appeared on my phone. A former client asking if I was available for new work. I smiled softly, feeling something unfamiliar but welcome, relief. I walked to the window and looked out at the city lights stretching into the distance. For the first time in a long while, I felt steady. Not angry, not afraid, just clear. Silence. I realized had never been weakness. It had been preparation. And if there's one thing I've learned through all of this, it's that the moment people believe you're powerless is often the moment you're quietly gathering strength. If you've ever been underestimated, if someone has ever tried to rewrite your story without your permission, I hope this reminds you that your silence can be your strategy too. And if this story made you think about your own strength, stay with me. There are more stories like this waiting to be told, and sometimes the next one might feel a little too familiar to ignore.